Future trading involves risk and is not suitable for all investors. Content provided in this segment is meant for educational purposes and is not a solicitation to buy or sell commodities.
Hi, it's Steve and Joe from Fresh Agenda, Evereg's Global Insights team. And Steve, we're here but not together.
Yeah, that doesn't mean it's a tragic thing. We're just in different locations.
That's right.
That's
But we
right.
do have some market updates, including this week's Pulse event, some New Zealand trade highlights, Steve, and of course, Chart of the Week.
Okay, let's go around the markets. But the biggest action is in Oceania skim milk powder, which has continued to weaken. You can see there we've had 3 weeks losing about $100 a tonne across the forward curve. May even weaken further after this week's pulse. We'll come on to that very shortly, but still a little bit above GDT, but a bit closer now. Moving to the pulse result, Joe.
Yeah, down 3% on the last auction. That event number 373 looks like a real anomaly on that chart now, doesn't it, Steve? So 3% down on the last auction and 1.9% down on the previous pulse. So we're basically back where we were a month ago, Steve.
Yeah, we are.
And just looking at the EX S&P futures, drifting weaker in the EU as well. There's sort of not a lot of new news there, but just not whole lot of demand to keep those futures buoyant. Is there?
No, it's coming down in the short term. It seems like there's this usual standoff between buyers and sellers. What buyers would like to get, like to be doing a bargain. They look their eyes at the world market seeing that weaken. Producers would like to get a bit more, but that's reaching some sensitive ground. And I think the demand side is the disappointment here.
Absolutely. And then just turning to the US CME non-fat dry milk futures, Steve, that's also weakening. I mean, I think the talk around the US markets at the moment is that California is emerging from those virus outbreaks on production, and that there is some recovery, although the last sort of data, it was still well down. But really, non-fat dry milk is coming back to the pack now, isn't it, Steve?
It is. And when you line them up, Joe.
Yeah. When you line up skim milk powder, that GDT, the latest event, CME futures and EEX, it really hasn't showed those New Zealand futures and the EEX futures are a long way apart, but really the CME is coming back to the pack now, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a real. I mean, further out they kind of line up, but it's a muddle.
And just turning now to whole milk powder futures on the NZ SGX. Bit softer, particularly in the forward month, Steve. Just losing a bit of momentum given that GDT result last week. And then we've got the pulse, which was also down 3.6% or $150 a tonne. So that's also down 3.5% on the pulse prior to this week's one. So it's the first drop for quite a few events, Steve. So it looks like maybe that run's come to an end.
Yeah, and the whole milk powder prices on GDT, Joe, have been, you know, peaked in that previous event, the highest since April 22. So we've been up on a good roll, but coming off that. So turning to butterfat, New Zealand futures have lifted a bit. There's heavy backwardation going on there, a sagging line, but they've lifted and a bit of support in Europe. But GDT continues to track up. So with confined butter volumes on GDT, the whole complex feels a bit heavy, and we'll talk about that in trade data. But yep, butter itself continues to move up.
Yeah, interesting.
And in the EEX as well. This is surprising. I know you covered this earlier in the week in our weekly rundown, Joe, but the butterfat market in Europe seems to be moving up and down, and it seems to yo-yo around a bit. And here we are again, and that bobble in May and June is quite interesting. But the market tone feels weaker. Cream prices have been easing. The sentiment is certainly negative there. You'd believe that going back a week, but there's been a huge lift in the last week, across the forward curve.
Yeah, and just where that leaves us in terms of the global butter comparison, Steve, GDT results are now pretty close to EU pricing. EU was way out ahead of everything else for such a long time, but really a little bit closer now between the EX futures and the NZX and GDT. And of course, CME well down on the other regions. And again, just reflecting the plentiful supply of cream in the US that is making its way into churns as we speak.
Turning to cheese, and look, cheddar in the US is always interesting. And here we have a spot quote, and just look at the volumes coming to the CME in car lots. It's been moving up and down all year, right? In small range and all year. It sounds a long time, but it's only a few weeks, really, 8 weeks. But yeah, it's bouncing around. And when we look at futures, though, it was quite a dip. So I hear this is about money moving further out and unloading on some of these shorter term futures. Seems to be the big move this week, but you're certainly not showing the pessimism that you would think with a lot of capacity coming online. Some interesting data. This was put together by Phil Plord, leader of our team, on big pizza, and just showing I mean, this is mostly about mozzarella, but it is, it's a fairly good barometer about the takeaway market and where people are spending, but just showing same store sales in the last year. And this Q4 numbers have been published across with an expectation of Papa John's there, but they're still trending down. So we're yet to find the bottom, it seems, in terms of that portion of the fast food market. Not great for cheese demand.
No, it's not at all.
And sticking with that, we come back to this chart every once in a while, just in terms of the barometer between European and US forward pricing. You can see that CME number there, and this was measured on the weekend, Joe. This has probably gone down a little bit this week because we can see that short-term market certainly the futures have fallen. So their gap's widened out a bit. The talk in Europe is that the cheese market is drifting lower with weaker fat, weaker protein, and it's getting harder to hold these values. So we may see the EU move down further, but pretty tense standoff between these two markets. Okay, across to New Zealand trade, and we have a big update here. Look, there's quite a lot, and I know I have selected a chart of the week from this data, Joe, but this is a pretty interesting set of data from New Zealand. We can talk about the whole year, but the trends are quite interesting.
Yeah, we've just got a chart there of the milk solid equivalent exports, Steve. It's just showing that trade measured in milk solids equivalents lifted 13% in January. And for the last 6 months, it's up 2.7%. And that's pretty much in line with milk growth for the season. There's been really strong year-on-year growth across the board, mostly to China, and that's offset the losses in sales to MENA for that period.
Just picking up on your comment there, Joe, about where trade has gone. And I put this in, this is not the short-term data, because in the month of January, we saw quite a lift in the Chinese trade. But this just adds up the last year versus 2021. So they're each 12-month comparisons. Just looking at how that mix of markets has changed. We've talked about the product mix quite a bit and how things have moved towards protein away from whole milk powder. But the big loss in volumes we've seen there, China's down 27% from the 21 total. And in 21, it made up 39% of all New Zealand trade. So it's quite a dependence. Shifted across to Southeast Asia, which is probably pretty healthy, but a large chunk has gone to the Middle East, North Africa, which is a far more price-sensitive market, particularly recently in powders and in butterfat. So it's just a bit more vulnerability for the export, if you like, the export portfolio of New Zealand. You can see their proteins in the US, that's certainly helped. That's pushed up that small chart, but there's some big numbers going in there and certainly higher value product. But an interesting change in the exposure.
So it's seen pretty strong year-on-year growth across the board in terms of products, Steve, except for skim milk powder. But when you look at that addition of skim milk powder and milk protein concentrates, you can see that that's really where it's gone, that shift into milk protein concentrates, mostly into the US. Fats have also been up as prices have weakened a little bit, so being able to move a bit more product, as you say, into those price-sensitive markets. Cheese is the real tearaway there, Steve. We can see a really strong increase in cheese exports, particularly for January, but it's been building over the last 3 to 6 months, hasn't it?
Yes, it has. So tell us more about the skim and MPC story, Joe.
Yeah, just looking at that addition of skim milk powder and milk protein concentrates, and this is in skim milk powder equivalent, Steve, so up 10% in the past year, and it's the highest ever in moving annual total terms. Where is it going? In the last year, 50% of that MPC trade has wound up in the US. And we know, Ireland has been quite absent from that market. So New Zealand's really filled the gap from those Irish exports that just weren't available. The US responsible for almost 60% of the growth in this trade. So it'll be interesting now that Ireland's kind of coming back, how they battle it out. But a third has come from China in terms of that demand, Steve. So, that's a pretty good story, I guess, in terms of managing the volume of skim milk powder out of New Zealand and moving it into these milk protein concentrates that have found ready markets.
Yeah, and I think the Irish will be watching very carefully the tariff play that might come from this because of the threats now to impose tariffs on the EU exports of dairy. And that will be quite a sensitive area for not only their MPCs, but also their butterfat exports, which we know are quite strong. Speaking of butterfat, and we talked about, New Zealand has got a lot of fat, and the fat trade hasn't moved quite as well along with the other products. The fat trade's been held together by China. So overall, for the past year, fat trade's been down nearly 8%, flat in the past 6 months, and a bit of a leap, obviously, in the latest data. But that's only been helped by the late revival, up 6.2 in the 3 months to January. But you see there that it's all on China, with other markets backing away from high prices that we've seen in this recent past. So how this rebalances, we can see more volume coming onto GDT, particularly in AMF, and pushing that price down to a record discount. So this is one of the interesting dynamics from here in the global market. So, Joe, I chose Chart of the Week because you're quite busy the last day or so, and I'm staying with trade.
Yeah, well, we've just talked about butter, so I guess we should talk about skim milk powder, Steve. And we're just looking at the New Zealand skim milk powder exports to China, and they were well up in January, very strong. It's not all good news, though, Steve. Just looking back at the last 3 to 12 months, we can really see that there's been a big demand loss from those price sensitive markets in Southeast Asia and MENA, and that's really offset the gains that New Zealand's made in China. So, some really interesting dynamics in terms of the skim milk powder exports out of New Zealand.
Okay. Well, that's all from us. This has been a very clunky performance, and hopefully you'll see none of that. But it just goes to show this is much better when we're together, Joe.
It is better when we're together.
Thanks for watching. We'll be back next week.